This week, the British Prime Minister Theresa May had her Brexit deal signed off by the European Union, but she still needs Parliament's backing here in the UK, and with so many parties against the current agreement, well, it's looking increasingly unlikely. She says it is the best deal for Britain with a few compromises, but after more than a year of negotiations, has Theresa May got it terribly wrong? So what are we going to see? Some deal, no deal, a new referendum to help us figure it out. At the Roundtable today, we have Stephen Timms, an opposition Labour MP who's on the Brexit Select Committee and says he will vote against the deal. Chris Curtis is with us, a pollster from YouGov, and Robert Oulds, director of the Bruges Group, a think tank that wants the UK to leave the EU but doesn't think this is the right way to go about it. A little bit of a muddle. A fair assumption, I think. Did you ever expect it to be anything but that? Chris, you first.
Well, actually, this is one of the interesting areas where our Parliament seems to be fairly representative of the views of the public, and that's in the fact that there isn't majority support for any given way forward. So the deal that Theresa May has put forward and is on the table, the vast majority of the public don't think that's the right deal. But they also don't really have a very unanimous opinion on the best way forward. So some people think that we should reverse Brexit. A lot of the people who voted Remain in the referendum think we should reverse Brexit or have another referendum, whereas a lot of the people that voted Leave want there to be something
But
harder.
Interesting you should say that the latest deal that's come back, the one that's been ticked off by the European Union, the one that Mrs May is going around the country trying her best to sell, you have already done enough research to determine that, in your opinion, it's going to be rejected by the people as well as by the Parliament.
Well, look, it's still early.
I mean, do you know?
It's still early days. Theresa May is going on a...
Are you guessing, or have you done research?
No, we've done the research. We've done the research.
Okay, so what have you come up with?
So based on our latest numbers, about 23% of the public say that they support the deal that Theresa May's brought back. About twice that number say they oppose it. There's still a reasonable, about a third of people who are still undecided. But based on the numbers so far at this stage, Theresa May has quite a lot of work to do in winning the public
So pretty close to 50%. If it's double the 23, pretty close to 50% say they don't like it, which leads me back to the initial question is, did you ever expect it to be anything other than this sort of mess? Robert, you first.
Well, the situation regarding Theresa May's negotiations with the European Union are a mess. This is because she has negotiated or really accepted the EU's demands and done so in a way that's been contrary to, really, in a sense, her own constitution. She's gone behind the back of her own Brexit secretary, her own department for exiting the European Union, and just negotiated or discussed with the European Union whatever they want, agree to what they want, through her advisors with her own Europe unit based in Downing Street. It's her, Theresa May, running things from the bunker at 10 Downing
But I do come back to the same question, which is, was it ever going to be anything else but this? I mean, you say you don't like the way she's done it, but do you have an idea of how she could have done it differently, better?
Well, agreeing to the European Union's timetable, their artificially created timetable...
Tell me how she could have done it better.
Well, the main mistake came when she agreed to the European Union, first of all, demanding that we have to have a Brexit divorced financial settlement before going on to the trade discussions, before the substantive issues.
This is the 50 billion that we hear about all
exactly, and really this shouldn't have been this way. According to Article 50, you should have been discussing the future relationship all at the same time and made these concessions.
For those that don't understand, Article 50 was the thing that went through Parliament that allowed us to sort of say, yes, we are going to leave the European Union. Let's get going now.
Yes, the European Union's own rules of how a country leaves the European Union, and we gave the notice to leave after a vote in Parliament where MPs gave the power to the government to take us out. But Theresa May has really, in these negotiations, we call them negotiations, but they weren't negotiations. They were attempts by her to win goodwill, which basically failed, and even offering the European Union that we wouldn't claim our fair share of the assets and we would pay all the liabilities that we arguably don't actually legally need to own.
They'd have shown her the door if that's what she'd have done straight away, don't you?
No, by debating hard, by holding a strong position, they would have held respect for her. But what they've done is they've recognised that she will always blink first in any negotiations, that will always make compromises to them, and they can just demand more and more out of her. So as soon as, over a year ago, as soon as she agreed to the European Union's way of doing things, it was quite clear that this situation was lost and she wouldn't deliver a substantive Brexit.
Stephen, you may want to add something to that, but I've got a question for you based on something that Robert has just said about triggering Article 50. Parliament approved that. Were you one of those that agreed that that should happen then?
No, I voted against triggering Article 50. I mean, I think Robert's got a point about the way the negotiations have been handled. We were told on the Brexit Select Committee in Parliament by 2 successive Brexit secretaries that the deal would be conditional and we wouldn't hand over the money until we'd got what we wanted. And that's proved now to be
Name names. Who were those two? Was
David
David
Davis and Dominic Raab.
So the most recent one and the very first one?
They both said to us that they wanted the future deal to be conditional.
Wanted it or said it would have to be conditional?
Well, they gave us the very clear impression that it would have to be conditional, otherwise they wouldn't support it. Of course, both of them have since resigned. But there is where I don't agree with Robert, there is a fundamental problem about leaving the European Union. And the problem is we want to carry on trading with the European Union. That means we will have to comply with the rules. But if we leave the EU, we don't have a say anymore over what the rules are. That's the fundamental difficulty. And I have some sympathy for Theresa May in trying to square that circle over the last 2.5 years. She's come back with an arrangement which nobody is very enthusiastic about, not even her. She tells us it's the best we can do and so on. But it reflects the fundamental problem that's been inherent in this exercise right from the start. We are economically dependent on trade with the EU, and in my view,
not when you look at the rest of our trade with the other parts of the world.
In my view,
it's relatively small.
In my view, it's getting on for a half. We need, in my view, to be in there making the rules, not walking away as we're proposing to do.
Who do you blame for this? Does it come back?
David Cameron.
Yes, I was going to say, does it come back to David Cameron because he was worried about splits within his own party and didn't expect it to be a yes.
And he didn't have a plan, and that's why the government was so unprepared. Why Theresa May had nothing like a plan to prevent the EU in the first place.
Would you say? One was David Cameron saying, "Look, I will bow to my Tory rebels. We will have a vote, but it won't go the way that they wanted to go." It did go their way. The second major mistake, Theresa May saying, "Listen, let's have an election. Give me the support. I'm going to make sure that I've got an enormous amount of backing here." Actually, it collapsed. She's now reliant upon minority parties.
The referendum wasn't a mistake. There was overwhelming support to have an in-out referendum on our EU membership.
But he didn't have to have it, did he?
Well, there was a motion in Parliament that actually voted for that. There was a manifesto commitment that gave a promise in the 2015 general election. There was 80% of people saying they wanted an in-out referendum, and all sides agreed there should be this in-out referendum. The Liberal Democrats were actually the first party to propose this in-out referendum. It was absolutely a matter of trust that they had to deliver it, and they did, and MPs voted for it overwhelmingly. After 7 months of debate in the House of Commons, the legislation got through and we held this in-out referendum, and that was the right thing to do, and people demanded it at the time, and thankfully the government delivered, and of course people voted to leave.
Yeah, I know, but if it weren't for the fact that he was upset about his own party and decided that he had to keep them in check by giving them this particular vote, we wouldn't be where we are
today. The Labour
would
Party had voted for the motion to have a referendum. They had approved it. Many Labour MPs had
We will get on to that, Stephen, and the Labour Party's position in just a moment.
Unanimous support in the House of Commons.
But Chris, you're sort of acting as a bit of an arbiter.
Well, I just on that point, I think that David Cameron thought, and I think based on the polling data correctly thought, that offering a referendum would help him win the subsequent general election, which obviously he did. And I don't think we can necessarily, as a pollster, I don't think we can necessarily blame our politicians.
You can allowed to wear 2 hats.
For doing what they for following through on actions that they think will help them win general elections. That is a part of their job.
It's otherwise known as democracy.
Yes. On the second point. I think, I'm on a panel here with a Remainer and a Leaver, and actually in our polling what we've seen, just like with you two, is we've had a divided country who have been reasonably divided on most of the things that we've been asking about on Brexit for the past 2 years. However, for one of the first times, the public are not divided on a Brexit-related issue, and that's this deal. The vast majority of Remain voters and the vast majority of Leave voters oppose this deal.
A group called the People's Vote, wanting a second referendum, say it's going to cost us £100 billion over the course of a number of years. That's in addition, I think, to the $50 billion we'd have to sort of put in the post in the form of a cheque. You say, Stephen, that you're getting letters from your constituents, emails as well, saying, for goodness sake, don't vote for this. But are you also seeing some people saying, look, this is a democratic process. We have got to go through with it?
Well, my constituents on the whole are not saying that. They're making the point we don't want this deal. And on the whole, that's coming from people who voted to stay in the European Union, but there are some who voted to leave who don't want the deal either in my constituency.
So what do they think should happen instead?
Writing to me. Well, they think that the Prime Minister should negotiate a better deal than the one we currently have. The reality is time is running out for that. And I think the answer probably is that we should have another popular vote on the basis of the decision
do you see what that might lead to?
Has negotiated. And I think what we should be said is a choice, a clear choice between, on the one hand, leaving the European Union on the basis of the deal the Prime Minister has negotiated, or staying in the EU.
But do you not see the difficulties that could lead to? Usurping a democratic vote by saying, look, we don't really like what we've heard, let's have another one. And there could be civil unrest. I mean, there would certainly be a more split country than there is now. Well, in my opinion.
In my opinion, it's perfectly reasonable, now that people know what the offer is for leaving the European Union, to ask people, is this what you really want? Or would we be better off, in fact, staying in the European Union? And I don't know how that decision would go. It may be that people would vote to leave on the basis of the Prime Minister's
What's the
deal.
support for a second referendum?
It actually depends how you ask the question, and it depends, of course, on what that referendum would be and the details. Is it going to be a referendum like you suggested on the deal versus staying in the European Union, or is it going to be against no deal? Generally speaking, the public's reasonably divided, though, so about equal support for having a referendum and not having a referendum. Interestingly, I think that if there were a referendum, Remain would start, or remaining in the European Union would probably start as the favourites, because we have seen some level of what we're calling regret. So people who voted leave last time, particularly Labour voters who voted leave last time, have now changed their mind and voted to remain.
Part of that, of course, may be because A, they're fed up with the Remoaners, those people who wanted to remain, who can't stop talking about how bad it's all going to be. And secondly, because of the way that the government has handled it.
Well,
it may not be that they think this is the wrong thing to do. They just, enough of it all.
Well, there hasn't been very much of it, but obviously you don't need very many people changing their mind to go from 48% to just the other side of that 58% line. We also think on top of that there'll be a slightly different electorate next time round, because obviously there'll be new people who have become 18, they're breaking for Remain, and there'll be some people
who are dead,
who have basically passed away, and the majority of them voted leave. So there'll be a slightly different electorate. And actually, the third thing. That
so what? Wait another 20 years until we've got a really young electorate who weren't even born when the thing was put to the referendum, and all the old wrinklies who said, I don't like the European Union, they've all fallen off their perch. That seems like quite a good idea.
I think one thing we would see if there was another referendum is probably more young people turning out to vote. There wasn't a big turnout amongst young people last time round. I think young people are very energised now. They do not want to leave the European Union, and I think they would turn out and vote.
That was the third thing I was going to say. And the third thing that we think that Remain would start the next referendum campaign's favourites is because Leave did a very good job at getting their voters out in the last referendum, and at best that would be hard for them to replicate. They might be able to do it, they might be able to do a better job, but I think that's unlikely.
What do you think? Second referendum?
Well, this is not going to quite simply, it's not going to happen. There needn't be a referendum question on Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, because the remedy is in Parliament, where 90 Conservative MPs will vote it down, perhaps even more. Almost all Labour MPs will vote it down. Chuka Umunna, Labour MP, thinks every single Labour MP will vote it down. The Scottish Nationalists will vote it down. The DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, will vote it down. Theresa May is actually now hoping that the Sinn Féin MPs will take up their seats in the House of Commons to vote for it. That's how little support there is for this. So there needn't be a referendum on the question, because on the 11th of December, when Parliament votes on it, they will vote it down. Theresa May thinks she'll bring it back again because she's being advised by her advisors that this is actually a popular deal. She's in the bunker, she's out of touch, she's not connected with reality. But the simple fact is there is not time to have a referendum. There is no way they can get the legislation through. The government isn't supporting it. There's not a majority in the House of Commons for another referendum. Even if there was...
I'm sorry, I'm not going to ask you...
Even if there was, it would take around at least 9 months to a year to hold this referendum. By then, we're long out of the European Union.
OK, and I'm not going to ask you what you think is going to happen if there is no deal, because, I mean, we've heard those arguments before, and they are all rather sort of speculative. But let me put this one to you. You're talking about... You say all Labour MPs are going to vote against it. Go back 1.5 generations. Labour was a very anti-European party. So what's made the European Union so attractive to your party now, other than the fact that you know that the opposition, the party in power, is making a bit of a mess of it?
We have enjoyed very significant economic benefits in the UK from being members of the European Union. That's the key and decisive consideration for me. There are lots of things one can criticise the EU for. I've been critical myself, but for me, it's the economic damage that would be done from leaving the EU which has to be the determining factor.
You really think we've had a few extra pounds in the Treasury because we've been members of the European Union?
We've certainly, economically, done much better inside the EU than we would have done outside it, and that's the potential for the future as well.
That's alternative history. You can't be certain of that. I'm suggesting it's more political, that Labour now doesn't want to agree with the government that getting out is the right thing to do, and therefore Labour, because it is a party in opposition, is simply saying, we're not touching this.
I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Harold Wilson, as Prime Minister, set up the last EU referendum that we had, and the country voted to stay in the European Union at that time, and Labour has been a pro-EU party since then.
Including your leader?
Well,
Jeremy Corbyn?
Jeremy has at times certainly expressed some highly Eurosceptic views, but he campaigned to remain in the referendum. He voted to remain in the EU.
There is a chance still that Theresa May will no longer be Prime Minister in 6 months, 2 months. It doesn't have to happen tomorrow. You then believe that the right people to lead this country are those oddballs, and I'm sure they wouldn't mind me calling them that, perhaps Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson. What have they got?
Well,
what credentials have they got?
They actually are honouring the manifesto commitments to take us out of the European Union. They're honouring the referendum result. They're honouring and respecting the way they voted in Parliament for voting for the Notification of Withdrawal Act and, of course, the European Union Withdrawal Act. They are the ones who are being consistent, sticking by their democratic mandate, and they're not the oddballs. Indeed, you'd argue that Theresa May is the oddball in this because she's going against her own manifesto, her own policy commitments, what she said she would deliver. She's actually rebelling against herself. And it's those people such as Jacob Rees-Mogg or Boris Johnson or any other member of Parliament who is against this agreement and still wants to leave that is being true to how they've said they would honour the referendum result. They're the Democrats and they're on the side of the majority as expressed in the opinion poll.
Chances of Theresa May going and Boris Johnson? Let's leave Jacob Rees-Mogg out of it because he'd be a bit real bolter from the blue. But Boris Johnson?
What I think
just through your opinion.
What I think is particularly interesting in this, of course, is in this situation, which I think is definitely not out of the question. I think some would argue fairly likely that Theresa May resigns quite soon and there's a Conservative Party leadership election. Of course, it's not going to be the general public that chooses the next Prime Minister. It's going to be about 100,000 or so Conservative Party members in Britain who decide who's running the country and carrying on with the most important negotiations that Britain's conducted in the past 50 years. Well, our polling back at the... We last polled Conservative Party members just after the Chequers, or just before the Chequers deal came back, so back in June and July. Back then, Boris's numbers weren't particularly great amongst Conservative Party members. He was behind, for example, the current Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, in terms of who Conservative Party members would vote for. I think he's probably the one to watch based on the figures that we were seeing amongst Conservative Party members. Jacob Rees-Mogg was the most popular amongst these members. However, of course,
it'd be a funny old world, though, wouldn't it? It would be a funny old world.
There's a difficulty there about whether he can make it onto the ballot paper in the first place. But he's got to be voted for by Conservative MPs, and it's uncertain whether he'd be able to make it to the top two and therefore make it onto the ballot paper to be voted on.
Let me ask you this, Stephen. On the Brexit Select Committee, I mean, you've had an awful lot of time to study this. What key mistakes do you think have been made that could have been avoided?
Well, I'm not sure the key mistakes could have been avoided. I think the key problems were inherent to leaving the EU in the first place. Because of this problem, we are so dependent on trade with the EU and therefore are going to have to keep close to EU rules. And the problem is if we end up in a position where we don't have any say over those rules. And there was no way around that. That's been clear.
Does that
from
bring
the start.
us back to my very first question? Was it always going to be like this? Because you're saying once the decision had been made that we were going to leave, none of this could have been avoided.
I think most of it could not have been avoided.
So
I think the problems
fault.
are inherent. And no, I wouldn't blame the Prime Minister for the fact she's come back with a very unsatisfactory deal. I think she has genuinely done her best to defend Britain's economic interests, given this decision to leave the EU. But the fact is, leaving will be economically very damaging to us, and that's why I still believe we've got to have another look at whether this is really the sensible thing to do.
Here's a left field question. Do you think, because all negotiators seem to like to take it to the brink, that perhaps the British team and the European team have sat down and talked about the rail politic, which is it's going to be a complete muddle if this doesn't go through Parliament. At the moment, it doesn't look like it will go through Parliament. So I tell you what we're going to do. We'll keep a couple of things in our back pocket until the last minute, and maybe this time next week, the European Union will say, under pressure from the British Prime Minister, look, okay, well, we're going to give a concession on that. We're going to, give a concession on something else. And that we could then see it saying, look, I have been tough. I've been able to win this. It is an even better deal now. Do you think that's at all possible?
I think one of the problems. I think one of the problems for the EU on this is that the view in the French newspapers and the German newspapers is the current deal is much too generous to the UK.
You would say that, though, wouldn't you?
Well, they would.
I mean, they would.
But it does mean it's going to be very difficult, I think, for President of France or the Chancellor of Germany to sign up to a significant concession in favour of the UK.
Okay, what would that concession? Sorry.
Go on then, sorry.
Well, what would that concession have to be for somebody who represents the pro-Brexit at all costs Bruges group?
The deal has become toxic. The withdrawal agreement that Theresa May has negotiated, even if there are a few tweaks, it is still absolutely toxic now in British politics.
So what's got to go?
Well, there's actually been other alternatives that have been looked at. Michel Barnier, the European Union's chief negotiator, has looked positively on what's known as a Canada Plus agreement, which would be the
plus, I think I heard
free trade agreement with between the European Union and Canada, with extra bits added on, such as a trade agreement with Korea.
Yeah.
There's off-the-shelf alternatives that are actually available, but there is a big need to actually look at this again and start again with the negotiations, and things can be achieved quite quickly because there are off-the-shelf alternatives. There's other models that can be used, and the European Union can move quickly if it really wants to, but at the moment they've not been given any reason to, because Theresa May has just agreed to whatever they want, and this is no way to conduct. It's not statecraft.
I'm not hurrying you, Chris, but relatively quickly, because I've got a question to which I would personally like to know the answer coming up in just a moment. So what we can say?
Well, what I was going to say is, as well, we don't know if she might have a couple of things in her back pocket, but I think one of the biggest moments of the next couple of weeks is going to be if there's this debate that she's planning, that's currently planned between Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn.
And Boris says he wants to get in on it.
Well, potentially, but if it's again between Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn, I think that could be particularly interesting because at the moment there are the vast majority, or not the vast majority, but a hell of a lot of Conservative voters who are currently not a fan of Theresa May's deal. What I think she's trying to do with this debate is frame it as a Conservative versus Labour issue and therefore increase support in the public amongst her own voters.
Probably going to happen, isn't it?
I think the chances are the debate will happen, yes.
Here is my question. Can anybody properly explain the backstop to me?
Well,
if there's deadly silence for the next 2 minutes, it won't be great telly. But
I'll have a go, and Robert's view will be very different.
This is not just for me, it's for others out there. What on earth are they talking about?
The problem is what happens on the Irish border. It's the only land border that the UK has with the EU 27.
Okay, I know that.
And nobody wants there to be checks, border guards,
yes,
barbed wire, which is what we had, before.
But what is the backstop?
Well, the backstop is the arrangement that if all else fails,
so no trade agreement, no deal,
we don't get a deal in time, there will still not be a hard border at the Northern Ireland crossing.
And how will that work?
Well, effectively, what has been agreed is we will stay in the EU's customs orbit, and so there won't have to be any customs checks. And effectively, Northern Ireland will stay in the single market for goods, so there won't have to be the kind of health checks which otherwise happen on the border as well.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed. You get my vote, even if she doesn't get
I'm grateful.
Your vote.
Please move to East Ham.
Robert, when's this all going to be sorted? Very quickly, you've got about 30 seconds.
We're going to vote the deal down on the 11th of December, but there needn't be a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. The head of the WTO has said so. There is actually already fuel monitoring from the Republic of Ireland to check that people aren't smuggling fuel across. There is a border already in terms of VAT, taxation, currency. There needn't be a border. Britain won't be putting up a border, neither will the Republic of Ireland. This is a bogus issue just to try and make the UK subscribe to the European Union's trade policy because they're scared of Britain being an independent country, following our own policies once we're outside of the European Union. So this issue is completely cooked up. It is bogus.
I don't think we know whether it's December the 12th or the 11th, but it's coming pretty soon, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
The 11th.
A couple of weeks.
It's definitely the 11th, is it?
We're sure it's the 11th now.
It's not a bogus issue. It's a real issue, the Northern Ireland border one.
I know, and we've only got a half-hour programme. Well, listen, thank you. The talking has to stop. It's taken 25 years to sort out the Northern Ireland troubles. We were never going to do it in half an hour here. Whether it is December the 11th or December the 12th, we will have to wait and see. Thank you all very much for joining me on this roundtable, although perhaps it might be worth considering if Theresa May would have been better off holding the vote on October the 31st. Goodbye for now.